The late afternoon sun bestowed a honeyed glow upon the village of St. Mead's, gilding the cobbles of the high street and setting the leaded windows of the old cottages ablaze. It was the kind of perfect, tranquil English day that seemed to exist solely to be admired, and there was no better place for such admiration than the garden of Laurel Lodge. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and newly cut grass, and the gentle clink of fine china formed a pleasant counterpoint to the murmur of well-bred conversation. It was the annual St. Mead's summer fete, and all the village society, such as it was, had turned out, seated in a comfortable wicker chair, strategically positioned to observe both the rose arbor and the refreshments table, was Miss Jane Marple. To the casual observer, she was merely a sweet, elderly lady, a fixture of such gatherings, her silver hair neat under a simple felt hat, her knitting needles clicking away with a gentle, rhythmic patience. She was a part of the scenery, as unremarkable and expected as the hollyhocks standing sentry by the garden wall. But behind her pale blue eyes, a keen and unsentimental intelligence was at work, cataloging, comparing, and drawing connections with the quiet efficiency of a master archivist. Her current subject of observation was the hostess herself, Mrs. Eleanor Calthrop. Eleanor was a handsome woman in her late 50s, whose life appeared to be a perfect monument to good taste and gentle prosperity. She moved through the throng of villagers with practiced ease, her smile never slipping, her compliments distributed like perfectly wrapped little gifts. Yet Miss Marple had noticed a certain rigidity in her posture, a faint, almost imperceptible tension around the eyes that spoke of a current of anxiety running beneath the polished surface. It reminded Miss Marple of her own housemaid, Lucy. On the days her ne'er-do-well brother came to call a smile plastered on for the sake of appearances, while inwardly calculating the cost. Another successful fate, Eleanor, boomed Colonel Arthur Wentworth, his large mustache quivering with approval. He was a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice, particularly when it was dispensing opinions on village matters. Splendid show. Simply splendid. You are too kind, Arthur, Eleanor replied, her voice a smooth, cultured stream. It's the least one can do for the community. Quite right, the colonel agreed, jabbing the air with his pipe. Community. That's what it's all about. Not like that fellow up at the old priory. A damned hermit, if you ask me. Doesn't contribute a thing. The fellow in question was Mr. Julian Croft, a man of indeterminate middle age and independent means who had purchased the dilapidated old priory on the edge of the village some 2 years prior. He was a source of endless fascination and mild distrust in St. Mead's, primarily because he kept to himself and showed no interest in integrating into the social fabric. He was, at this very moment, standing somewhat apart from the main group, nursing a glass of lemonade and looking profoundly uncomfortable. He was a lean, sharp-featured man, with eyes that darted about as if assessing the gathering for its tactical weaknesses. Now, Arthur, we mustn't judge, Eleanor chided gently, though her gaze followed the colonel's towards the solitary figure. Mr. Croft is simply private. Not everyone is cut out for village life. Private? Rubbish. He's rude, retorted the colonel's wife, Beatrice, a small, bird-like woman whose sharp eyes missed very little. I called on him last month with a welcome basket from the Women's Institute. He took it with a grunt and shut the door before I'd even finished speaking. Most peculiar. Miss Marple's needles clicked on. She thought of Mr. Croft as rather like a certain type of shrub she had in her own garden, prickly and difficult to transplant, but not necessarily malevolent. His isolation, she suspected, was a defense, not an affectation. She also noted the way Eleanor Calthrop's eyes lingered on Mr. Croft, not with the village's simple curiosity, but with a look of complex and wary assessment, The conversation ebbed and flowed around Miss Marple. Young Dr. Stephen Mayhew, new to the village and full of a bright, modern energy, was discussing the church roof fund with the vicar, Mr. Pettigrew. The doctor's sister, Clara, a pretty, vivacious girl of 20, was laughing with the postmaster's son, a flush of pleasure on her cheeks. It was all so very normal, so perfectly composed. A charming tapestry of English village life, not it was then that the final guest of note arrived. The gentle hum of conversation faltered for a moment as Lydia Marchant swept into the garden. Lydia was Eleanor Calthrop's younger cousin, recently arrived from London following a vague series of misfortunes. She was everything Eleanor was not, flamboyant where Eleanor was restrained, artfully dramatic where Eleanor was naturally elegant. She wore a dress of a slightly too vivid magenta, and her laughter was a shade too loud for the serene setting. "Darlings, forgive me," she exclaimed, her voice carrying across the lawn. The most dreadful traffic on the lane from Chelmsford. One would think they'd never seen a motor car before. She air-kissed Eleanor's cheek, a performance that struck Miss Marple as being entirely for the benefit of the audience. "The fate looks divine, Ellie, simply divine." Eleanor's smile tightened at the edges. "We're so glad you could make it, Lydia. We've saved you a slice of Mrs. Dutton's plum cake." "Heaven!" Lydia declared, though her eyes were already scanning the crowd, alighting with interest on the brooding figure of Julian Croft. "And who is that?" "A new face." "How thrilling." Miss Marple, watching this little pantomime, was put in mind of a story she had once read about a cuckoo. It was a quiet, unsettling thought, and she tucked it away for later consideration. She saw the way Eleanor's hand, for just a second, clenched the silver locket she always wore at her throat. It was a tiny, fleeting gesture, but to Miss Marple, it was as revealing as a shout. The afternoon wore on in its pleasant, predictable way. Cakes were consumed, lemonade was drunk, and the tombola raised a respectable sum for the church. As the sun began to dip below the yew hedge, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn, Eleanor Calthrop clapped her hands gently for attention. "My dear friends," she began, her voice warm and carrying, "thank you all for coming. Before we disperse, I have a little tradition to uphold, as you know. A small token of thanks for our community." She moved to a small, ornate wooden box placed on a stone plinth near the house. From it, she withdrew a single beautifully crafted beeswax candle, tall and pale gold, set in a heavy silver holder. "The candle of St. Mead's," she announced, holding it aloft. "A symbol of the light our village brings to the world. This year, I've decided to bestow it upon someone who, though new to us, has shown quiet dedication to preserving our local history. Mr. Julian Croft." A ripple of surprised murmurs ran through the crowd. Julian Croft looked as if he had been struck. He stared at Eleanor, his face a mask of confusion that quickly hardened into something else, something that looked remarkably like suspicion. "Go on." "Man, don't be shy," Colonel Wentworth boomed. Mistaking his hesitation for modesty, slowly, reluctantly, Croft stepped forward. He took the candle from Eleanor, his fingers brushing against hers. Miss Marple, her eyes sharp, saw him flinch at the contact. "Thank you," he muttered, the words seeming to be dragged from him. He looked down at the candle in his hands, as if it were a venomous snake. "It's traditional to light it in your home tonight," Eleanor said, her smile unwavering, "to welcome the spirit of St. Need's." Croft gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod and retreated swiftly back to his isolated spot, the candle held awkwardly before him. The moment passed, the crowd began to break up, and the splendid little gathering started to draw to its natural close. Miss Marple gathered her knitting into her bag, her movements slow and deliberate. She had seen the exchange, the forced smile, the flinch, the suspicious glare. It was, she thought, A very odd way to receive a gift of friendship. It spoke not of social awkwardness, but of something deeper, something fraught with an unspoken history. As she made her farewells and began her slow walk home down the twilight lane, the image of that pale, unlit candle stayed with her. It was a symbol of light, yes, but in the hands of Julian Croft, it felt more like a portent, a promise of a flame that was yet to be kindled, or perhaps one that had already been dangerously extinguished. The following morning, in St. Mead's dawned with the soft, pearly gray light that often follows a perfect summer day. The air was fresh, carrying the damp, earthy scent of dew on petunias. In her cozy cottage, Miss Marple was enjoying a breakfast of lightly boiled eggs and thin, precisely buttered toast, her routine as immutable as the tide. The St. Mead's Gazette, delivered with the dawn, lay folded beside her plate. Its front page was, as usual, a monument to rural tranquility, a report on the Fate success, a notice about a lost dog, and a debate on the proposed new bench for the churchyard. It was the heavy, rapid tread on her garden path that first signaled a shift in the day's tenor. A moment later, there came a firm, urgent knock at her front door. Her help, the excellent and inquisitive Cherry, bustled from the kitchen to answer it, returning with a face alight with solemn excitement. "It's Police Constable Edwards." "Miss," Cherry announced. P.C. Edwards, a large, earnest man, whose uniform always seemed a size too tight, filled the doorway of the dining room, his helmet held respectfully in his hands. His broad, normally placid face was etched with lines of profound consternation. "I do apologize for the intrusion, Miss Marple," he began, his voice a low rumble. "But there's been a bit of a turn-up." "Do sit down, Constable," Miss Marple said gently, gesturing to a chair. "Cherry, perhaps a cup of tea for Mr. Edwards. You look as though you've had a shock." "That I have, miss, that I have." He sank into the proffered chair, looking grateful. "It's Mr. Croft, up at the old priory." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had been poised to resume their work, stilled. "Mr. Croft, the gentleman from the Fate?" "The very same, miss. His housekeeper, Mrs. Pickering, found him this morning. In his study." The constable paused, collecting himself. "He's dead, Miss Marple." A respectful silence filled the room, broken only by the clink of a teacup as Cherry set it down before the constable. Miss Marple's expression was one of polite, concerned interest, but her mind was racing, assembling the pieces from the previous afternoon with swift, quiet efficiency. "How very dreadful," she murmured. "The poor man, was it his heart? He did seem a rather highly strung individual." "That's just it, miss." P.C. Edwards leaned forward, his voice dropping further. "It doesn't look like his heart. Not unless his heart made him smash a valuable silver candle holder over his own head." He took a gulp of tea. "The candle of St. Mead's, it was. The one Mrs. Calthrop gave him just last night. It was lying on the floor beside him, all bent out of shape. And the candle itself was nowhere to be found." This last detail hung in the air, peculiar and resonant. The murder. Weapon, a symbol of community, bestowed in a public ceremony. The missing candle, the very heart of the symbol. It was, Miss Marple thought, unnecessarily theatrical, and therefore deeply human. "Good heavens," she said, her tone perfectly calibrated to express the appropriate level of village lady shock. "But who would do such a thing? He was something of a recluse, was he not? That's the question, isn't it?" The constable said, a note of professional pride entering his voice. "We've already had a bit of a break. Colonel Wentworth was out with his dog, Buster. Early this morning, can't stand the man himself, but walks the dog religiously. He does. He says he saw a figure, a woman, he thinks, in a bright-colored coat, hurrying away from the lane that leads to the old priory around 6:30. He called out a good morning, But the person didn't turn, just quickened their pace and disappeared into the mist. "A bright-colored coat," Miss Marple repeated softly. Her mind's eye presented her with an immediate and vivid image. Lydia Marchant's magenta dress, blazing against the green serenity of Eleanor Calthrop's lawn. How very distinctive. "Exactly, miss. And we all saw Miss Marchant in a very similar color just yesterday. Stands to reason, doesn't it? She's new, she's flashy, and she was mighty interested in Mr. Croft at the fete. We all saw it." P.C. Edwards set his cup down with a decisive clink. "Inspector Druitt is on his way from Maidenford. I'd best be getting back. I just thought you ought to know, seeing as you were there when it all started, in a manner of speaking." After seeing the constable out, Miss Marple returned to her cooling tea. The news was shocking, yet it settled with a strange inevitability. The tension she had observed, the flinch, the suspicious glare, they were not merely the ingredients of social awkwardness. They were the precursors to a final, violent act. But the obviousness of the clue, the bright coat, the colonel's testimony struck her as almost clumsy. It was like something from a bad novel, she thought, where the villain wears a sign around their neck. Real evil, in her experience, was far more adept at camouflage. The village, of course, was soon buzzing. News traveled through St. Mead's not by wire or print, but by a kind of osmotic gossip, flowing from garden gate to shop counter to vicarage doorstep. By mid-morning, as Miss Marple made her customary trip to the post office to buy stamps she did not strictly need, the air was thick with speculation. "A woman in red," the colonel said. "Always knew he was mixed up in something shady. That London cousin of Eleanor's, mark my words. The candle of St. Mead's. The very idea. It's an omen, that's what it is." In the queue, Miss Marple encountered Beatrice Wentworth, the colonel's wife. Her small, sharp face was pinched with a mixture of distress and vindication. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it terrible?" she began without preamble. "Arthur is quite shaken. To think he actually spoke to the murderer. He said there was a furtive quality about the person's gait. He's with Inspector Druitt now, giving his full statement. How very trying for him," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "It must have been a great shock. A mist can play such tricks on the eyes, can it not?" "Oh, no. Arthur's eyesight is excellent," Beatrice said firmly. "He's a crack shot, you know. He never misses a detail. And he's quite certain about the color. A vibrant pink, almost red, just like that dress Lydia Marchant was flaunting yesterday." She lowered her voice. "Between us, she's been nothing but trouble for poor Eleanor since she arrived. Always borrowing money, leaving late at night. She has the morals of a cat, that one." Miss Marple made a non-committal, gentle noise. She purchased her stamps, and on her way home, took a slight detour that passed by the gates of Laurel Lodge. She did not stop, but she slowed her pace, her gaze taking in the serene, well-ordered front garden. The house looked peaceful, untouched by the tragedy unfolding at its edges. But as she looked, a first-floor curtain twitched, and for a fleeting second she saw the pale, strained face of Eleanor Calthrop looking out before the fabric fell back into place. The obvious suspect was being neatly presented, wrapped in a bright magenta bow. The police, with the colonel's testimony, would be eager to pounce. It was all so very convenient. But as Miss Marple continued her walk, her mind kept returning, not to the flamboyant Lydia, nor to the brooding victim, but to the hostess of the fete, to Eleanor Calthrop's rigid smile, her tense eyes, and the way her fingers had clenched, just for a moment, around the silver locket at her throat. The candle had been extinguished, but for Miss Marple, a different, more subtle light had begun to glimmer, casting long and troubling shadows over the peaceful facade of St. Mead's. The following afternoon found Miss Marple paying a call at Laurel Lodge. It was, she felt, the proper thing to do. A murder in a small community was a shock to the system, like a stone thrown into a still pond, and it was the duty of its members to offer support, however small. She carried with her a small basket containing a pot of her own strawberry jam and a sprig of lavender, tokens of sympathy that were as much a part of village code as a black armband dot. She was shown into the morning room by a flustered-looking maid. The room, usually so bright and airy, felt subdued. The sunlight filtered through the net curtains as if too shy to intrude. Eleanor Calthrop sat on a chintz sofa, her posture as perfectly upright as ever, but the strain was now unmistakable. The fine lines around her eyes seemed more deeply etched, and her hands, resting in her lap, were tightly clasped. "My dear Eleanor," Miss Marple began, her voice soft with a concern that was entirely genuine, if also strategically employed. "I am so very sorry. What a dreadful, dreadful business. To think it all began here, in your lovely garden." Eleanor's smile was a fragile thing, threatening to shatter at any moment. "Thank you, Jane. It is a nightmare. 1 minute, a celebration of our little community, and the next, this. That candle." She trailed off, her gaze drifting towards the garden, as if she could still see Julian Croft's suspicious face. "I feel somehow responsible. If I had never given it to him." "Now, you mustn't think like that," Miss Marple chided gently, settling herself in the armchair opposite. "You acted with nothing but kindness. The fault lies entirely with the wicked person who wielded it as a weapon." She paused, allowing the silence to settle for a moment. "The police have been to see you, I suppose?" A shadow passed over Eleanor's face. "Yes, that Inspector Druid. A very thorough man. He was here for over an hour. He asked a great many questions about the fate, about who spoke to whom, about the candle itself." Her hand fluttered unconsciously to her throat, to the silver locket she always wore. "And of course, he asked about Lydia." "It is only natural, I suppose," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes following the movement of Eleanor's hand. The locket was an elegant, oval-shaped piece, seemingly old. They must follow every line of inquiry, however uncomfortable. "He as good as accused her." Eleanor's composure cracked, a flash of protective anger in her eyes. "Because Arthur Wentworth saw a splash of color in the mist. It's preposterous. Lydia may be impulsive, and her taste may be a little vivid for St. Mead's, but she is not a murderess." "I am sure it is just a formality," Miss Marple soothed. "The Colonel is a fine man, but the morning mist can be a great deceiver. I remember my nephew, Raymond, once mistook Mrs. Prescott's prize tabby for a fox in the early haze. Gave the poor creature quite a fright." This homely, irrelevant anecdote seemed to calm Eleanor slightly, the absurdity of it acting as a balm. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did Mr. Croft seem at all troubled when he left the fete?" "I only ask because he did seem rather preoccupied when he accepted your gift." Eleanor's gaze dropped to her hands. "He was always preoccupied, Jane. A deeply troubled man, I always thought. But yes, last night, he was more so. He left almost immediately after receiving the candle. He barely said a word. I thought he was just being his usual rude self." She sighed, a sound of genuine weariness. "Now, I wonder if he had a premonition." "Or perhaps," Miss Marple suggested softly, "he had a reason to be fearful of someone who was here." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened and Lydia Marchant swept in. She was a study in dramatic distress, dressed not in bright magenta today, but in a somber navy that somehow seemed just as theatrical. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but whether from genuine tears or artful application of a salts bottle, Miss Marple could not be sure. "Oh, Ellie, it's too awful," Lydia exclaimed, sinking onto the sofa beside her cousin and grasping her hand. "That dreadful inspector has just left me. He questioned me for an age, He all but said I was seen fleeing the scene of the crime. Me. It's slander, that's what it is. There, Lydia, Eleanor said, patting her hand with a mechanical kindness. It is a terrible misunderstanding. I was just telling Jane. Lydia's eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered towards Miss Marple. Oh, hello, Miss Marple. I suppose the whole village is talking about it. They've probably already tried and convicted me in the court of public opinion. She produced a lace handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes. I told the inspector I was home all last evening and all this morning. I had a dreadful headache. I didn't set foot outside until I came here to comfort poor Ellie. A headache, Miss Marple echoed sympathetically. How unfortunate. And you live in that charming little cottage on Sycamore Lane, do you not? So peaceful. One can hear the birds so clearly there in the morning. Lydia's gaze sharpened, a flicker of uncertainty in them. Why, yes, quite. It is a blessing to have such a quiet refuge, Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational, especially when one is feeling unwell. And you have a housekeeper, I believe? A Mrs. Dingle, is it? The hesitation was barely perceptible, but it was there. No, I have a girl who comes in mornings. But she wasn't there yesterday evening, of course. I was quite alone. Lydia's grip on the handkerchief tightened, which is why it's simply my word against that old fool Wentworth's. Lydia, please, Eleanor murmured, a note of strain returning to her voice. Miss Marple observed the two women. Eleanor, a picture of strained respectability, defending her flashy cousin with a loyalty that seemed, to Miss Marple's sharp eyes, to be rooted in something deeper than mere family duty. And Lydia, playing the role of the wronged woman with a little too much flair. Her alibi was fragile, resting on no one's testimony but her own. It was the perfect alibi for a guilty person, or a very careless one for an innocent. After offering a few more comforting words and pressing the jam upon a grateful Eleanor, Miss Marple took her leave. As she walked down the path, her mind was not on the flamboyant Lydia and her unconvincing tears, but on Eleanor Calthrop. It was the locket that fascinated her. Twice now, at moments of high stress, Eleanor's hand had flown to it, like a talisman or a secret shame. It reminded her of a story from her own youth, of a girl in St. Mary Mead who had received a locket from a young man who later proved to be entirely unsuitable. She had worn it not out of affection, but as a constant, prickling reminder of a mistake she was desperate to hide. Miss Marple wondered what mistake, what secret from the past, was held within the cool silver confines of Eleanor Calthrop's locket. For in her experience, the past never stayed buried. It had a nasty habit of clawing its way back into the present, often with violent consequences. And the candle of St. Mead's, it seemed, had provided the light by which that past could finally be seen. The following Tuesday found Miss Marple in her natural habitat, the village wool shop, Clemence's Knits. It was a place of quiet industry, and more importantly, a prime conduit for the lifeblood of St. Mead's information. The small bell above the door had barely finished its chime before she was enveloped in the familiar, comforting smells of lanolin and beeswax. The proprietor, Miss Clemence herself, a woman with the sharp, discerning eyes of a magpie and a mind that catalogued gossip as efficiently as her ledger tracked skeins of yarn, looked up from behind the counter. Her current customer was Mrs. Dutton, the baker's wife, whose plum cake had been such a success at the fête. Their conversation halted abruptly, but not before Miss Marple's keen ears had caught the tail end of it, and the inspector was in the bakery for a full 20 minutes, asking about. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Miss Clemence said, her voice a touch too bright. "A dreadful business, isn't it?" "Simply dreadful." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, sighing softly as she ran a practiced hand over a bundle of sky-blue cashmere. "It casts such a pall over everything. One no longer feels safe even taking a morning stroll." This opening was all Mrs. Dutton needed. Safe? I should think not, with a murderess loose in the village. My herald said he's never seen the inspector look so grim. They're focusing their inquiries, he said, on a certain person. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. They're looking into train tickets. Miss Marple's eyebrows raised in polite inquiry. Train tickets? To London, Miss Clements supplied, unable to be left out of the revelation. The early train from Maidenford, the 6:15. The ticket clerk, young Timmy Briggs. You know him. Ada Briggs's boy was questioned. The police wanted to know if he'd sold a single ticket to a woman yesterday morning. And had he? Miss Marple asked, her tone one of mild, grandmotherly curiosity. Mrs. Dutton leaned in, her voice dropping further. He couldn't say for certain. It was foggy. He was half asleep, and he said a woman in a big hat and a coat with a collar turned up on a ticket, but he didn't get a proper look at her face. But he did say one thing. She paused for dramatic effect. He said the hand that passed the money was very well kept, with a distinctive ring, a silver ring with a dark blue stone. A silence fell over the wool shop. Miss Marple recalled, with perfect clarity, the ring on Lydia Marchant's hand as she had dabbed her eyes with her handkerchief at Laurel Lodge. A silver ring set with a lapis lazuli stone. It seems, Miss Marple murmured, that the net is closing. She selected a skein of pale gray wool. This will do for a new cardigan, I think. The nights are drawing in. As Mrs. Dutton, her news delivered, took her leave with a satisfied air, Miss Marple engaged Miss Clements in a discussion of knitting patterns. It was a meandering conversation, touching upon the vicar's new vestments, and the sorry state of the miller boy's socks, before Miss Marple, with an air of idle reminiscence, guided it back to the topic at hand. It is a pity for Eleanor, she sighed. First, her cousin is under such a cloud, and now I hear the police have been asking questions about her late husband Charles. Miss Clements's needles, which had been clicking busily, stilled for a fraction of a second. Have they? Well, I suppose they have to be thorough. Such a tragedy is passing. A boating accident, wasn't it? Down in Cornwall. Yes, just over 3 years ago, Miss Marple said. Eleanor was quite devastated. She wore black for a full year. Poor thing. She and Charles were so devoted. It was a true love match, everyone said. Miss Clements made a non-committal noise, her eyes fixed on her knitting. Oh, yes, everyone said so. There was a wealth of unspoken commentary in that single, clipped sentence. One does wonder, Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle and musing, if poor Mr. Croft's arrival stirred up painful memories for her. He was, I understand, something of an expert in antiquities. And Charles Calthrop had such a fine collection of old silver, did he not? I remember that beautiful locket he gave Eleanor. She wears it still. The change in the atmosphere was subtle but distinct. Miss Clements looked up, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a long, significant moment. The wool shop was a vault of secrets, and its keeper was deciding whether to turn a key. Charles Calthrop, Miss Clements said slowly, was a man who liked beautiful things. His collection, his wife, his friends. She paused, choosing her words with the care of a diplomat. There were rumors, after he died, not about the accident, about his finances. Finances? Miss Marple prompted, her expression one of innocent surprise. A few of the larger pieces from his collection were sold off quietly by Eleanor not long after the funeral. To settle debts, it was said. Miss Clements dropped her voice. But my sister lives in Maidenford, and her husband is in insurance. He heard from a valuer that Charles had had some of his most prized pieces valued just a month before he died, including that locket. It's not just silver, you know. It's Georgian. Quite valuable. Miss Marple absorbed this information like a parched plant absorbing water. How very interesting. So Eleanor might have had financial pressures after all, despite the appearance of Laurel Lodge. And then Mr. Croft, an expert, comes to the village. She let the sentence hang, unfinished. It makes you think, doesn't it? Miss Clements said meaningfully. And that locket. I always thought it was a strange gift for a man to give his wife. So old, almost second-hand. I heard a story once, from a cousin of mine who summered in Cornwall, that Charles was seen there, more than once, with another woman. A flashy, artistic type, the kind who might appreciate antique jewelry. The pieces, disparate and seemingly unconnected, were beginning to drift towards one another in Miss Marple's mind. A financially troubled widow, a valuable locket from a possibly unfaithful husband, a reclusive antique expert new to the village, and a flamboyant cousin, conveniently providing a splash of color for the authorities to chase Dot it was. She thought, like one of those tangled balls of yarn that young children create. The more you pulled on the obvious, brightly colored thread, the thread of Lydia Marchant, the tighter and more complex the knot at the center seemed to become. And at the center of this particular knot, Miss Marple was beginning to suspect was not Lydia, but the serene and respectable Eleanor Calthrop, and the secret she wore around her neck. The police, as represented by the dogged Inspector Druitt, were indeed pulling hard on the bright thread of Lydia Marchant. 2 days after Miss Marple's illuminating visit to the wool shop, the village was electrified by the news that Lydia had been formally asked to present herself at the Maidenford police station for further questioning. She had gone. It was recorded by the postman who saw her leave. In a state of high indignation, her lawyer asleek, city-looking gentleman following in a separate car. This development seemed to bring a measure of grim satisfaction to Colonel Wentworth, who confirmed his testimony with military precision to anyone who would listen in the public bar of the Mead and Stag. The case, in the eyes of St. Mead's, was as good as solved. The outsider, the flashy Londoner with no alibi, had been caught in the act, both by the Colonel's eagle eyes and the ticket clerk's memory of a ring. Miss Marple, however, found the neatness of the solution profoundly unsettling. It was all too pat, too convenient. A mind capable of such a brutal, close-quarters act, she reasoned, was unlikely to be so careless as to wear such identifiable clothing or jewelry during its execution. It spoke of a theatricality that, while it fitted Lydia's general demeanor, felt more like a performance than a reality. It was this line of thought that led her, on a pleasantly warm afternoon, to the gardens of the vicarage. The vicar, Mr. Pettigrew, was a kindly, somewhat distracted man, but his wife, Amelia, was a keen gardener and a sensible, observant woman. More importantly, the vicarage garden abutted the Wilder, overgrown grounds of the old priory, and its high stone wall offered a certain privacy for a confidential chat. "The lavender is coming along beautifully, Amelia," Miss Marple remarked, snipping a few stems with the small cicateur she had brought. "Such a comforting scent." "It is, isn't it?" Amelia Pettigrew agreed, kneeling back on her heels and pushing a stray gray hair from her damp forehead. "Though it's hard to find much comfort in anything at the moment, with that great, gloomy house staring down at us." She nodded towards the priory, its gabled roofs visible above the wall. "It feels different now, sinister." "It is the absence of life that does that," Miss Marple said. "A house needs people, even difficult people." She paused, arranging the lavender in her basket. I saw the police car leaving earlier. They must be finished with their examination." Amelia shuddered. "For now, I suppose. Poor, wretched man. To die like that, all alone. It makes one wonder what he was really like. We never knew him, did we?" "Not really. That is the tragedy of it," Miss Marple agreed. "He was a closed book, though I believe Eleanor Calthrop may have known a little more of his story than most." The vicar's wife looked up. Her interest piqued. "Eleanor? What makes you say that?" "Oh, nothing specific," Miss Marple demurred. "Just a feeling. The way she looked at him at the fete. It wasn't the simple curiosity of the village. It was more knowing. And then, of course, there was the business with the locket." Amelia Pettigrew was too well-bred to press, but she was also human. She waited, patiently, weeding around a rosebush. "It's just that I remember Charles giving it to her," Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational. "Such a distinctive piece. Georgian, I understand. Quite valuable. I suppose Mr. Croft, being an expert, would have recognized its worth immediately. Perhaps he even commented on it. Men of expertise so often feel the need to share their knowledge, don't they?" A subtle change came over Amelia's face. She stopped her weeding. "You know, Jane, that's rather odd that you should say that." "Is it, dear?" "Yes, because I saw them. About a fortnight ago. Eleanor and Mr. Croft. They were in the churchyard." This was new. Miss Marple's expression remained one of mild curiosity. "In the churchyard? How unusual. I wouldn't have thought Mr. Croft the type for quiet contemplation among the headstones." "Neither would I," Amelia said, her voice dropping, though they were quite alone. "I was in the vestry, arranging flowers, and I saw them through the window. They weren't by the newer graves. They were over in the old section, near the Calthrop family plot. They were talking. It didn't look like a casual conversation." "An argument?" Miss Marple ventured gently. "Not quite. It was more intense. Mr. Croft was doing most of the talking, very earnest, leaning towards her. And Eleanor, she had that closed-off look she gets when she's distressed. Her hand was at her throat, fiddling with that locket of hers. Then he said something, and she actually took a step back, as if he'd struck her. She shook her head very firmly, and then she turned and walked away very quickly. He just stood there, watching her go." Miss Marple processed this. A clandestine, intense meeting in the churchyard. A conversation that caused Eleanor visible distress, centering around the locket. This was no simple matter of a recluse being rude. This was a history. "How very strange," Miss Marple murmured. "And you never saw them speak again?" "Never. In fact, at the fete, I thought it was the first time they'd been in the same room since. The air between them was charged." Amelia looked troubled. You don't think Eleanor could have had anything to do with—" "My dear Amelia," Miss Marple said, her voice firm but kind, "we must not jump to conclusions. It is a terrible thing to suspect a friend, but it is also a terrible thing for an innocent person, like poor Lydia, to be suspected in their place." She snipped another sprig of lavender. "The truth has a way of making itself known, often in the most unexpected places. One must simply know where to look." As she walked home, the scent of lavender filling her basket, Miss Marple felt the first solid stirrings of certainty. The confrontation in the churchyard was the key. Julian Croft had not been a random victim. His murder was personal, rooted in a secret that Eleanor Calthrop was desperate to keep. The candle, the very public bestowal of it, now seemed less like a gesture of community and more like a signal, or perhaps a provocation. But what was the secret held within that silver locket? And how did it connect to the man now lying dead in the old priory? The puzzle was becoming clearer, and the picture it was forming was a deeply unsettling one. The arrest of Lydia, Marchant sent a seismic shock through St. Mead's, though it was a shock tinged with a grim sense of inevitability. Inspector Druitt, a man who prized efficiency and clear, tangible evidence, had found his case. The combination of Colonel Wentworth's testimony, the ticket clerk's recollection of the ring, and Lydia's own volatile and unconvincing demeanor under questioning had proven too compelling to ignore. She was taken to Maidenford to be formally charged, her protests of innocence echoing in the still air of the village high street, before being swallowed by the slam of a police car door. With the arrest, a collective, if uneasy, sigh of relief seemed to pass through the community. The dangerous element had been removed. Order was restored. At the Mead and Stag, the Colonel was, for an evening, the hero of the hour, his keen observation credited with solving the case. Miss Marple observed this return to normality with a profound sense of disquiet. She sat in her quiet parlor, the evening light fading outside her window, and turned the facts over in her mind like worrying a loose tooth. It was all wrong. The case against Lydia was a facade, a carefully constructed stage set that hid the true drama playing out in the wings. She was certain of it now. The conversation in the churchyard, the financial pressures, the locket, they all pointed away from the flamboyant cousin and towards the serene widow. But certainty was not proof. It was, as she often thought, like knowing a cake was bad without being able to point to the specific spoiled ingredient. Her opportunity to search for that ingredient came, as such opportunities often did, in the guise of a social call. Eleanor Calthrop, liberated from the shadow of her cousin's immediate presence, though surely not from the scandal, had announced she would be at home to visitors. It was a brave attempt to reclaim her social position, to demonstrate that while her family might be flawed, her own standing was unassailable. Laurel Lodge felt different this time. The atmosphere was lighter, the curtains thrown wide to let in the sun. Eleanor herself, while still pale, seemed less strained, as if a great weight had been lifted. She presided over the tea tray with a semblance of her old grace. "It is a horrible business, of course," she was saying to Dr. Stephen Mayhew and his sister Clara, who had also come to pay their respects. "But we must trust in the law. Lydia will have her day in court, and the truth will out." She said this with a quiet conviction that struck Miss Marple as just a little too rehearsed. "A dreadful ordeal for you, Mrs. Calthrop," Dr. Mayhew said, his young, earnest face full of sympathy. "The police can be very blunt in their methods." "One must endure these things," Eleanor replied, pouring the tea with a steady hand. "It is the price of belonging to a community, I suppose. We all must play our part." It was then that Miss Marple made her move. As she reached forward to accept her cup, she deliberately fumbled with her small beaded reticule. It tipped, spilling its contents: a handkerchief, a mint imperial, a small notebook, and a single, long knitting needle onto the Persian rug at Eleanor's feet. "Oh, my dear, how clumsy of me!" Miss Marple exclaimed, her voice fluttering with believable embarrassment. Not at all. Let me help you, Eleanor said smoothly, setting down the teapot and bending to gather the scattered items. It was the work of a moment. As their hands moved amongst the spilt contents, Miss Marple's gaze, sharp and missed by everyone else in the room, fell upon the silver locket at Eleanor's throat. It had come unfastened during her movement, the delicate clasp loosened by the act of bending down. The locket had swung open, and inside, Miss Marple saw it. Not a miniature portrait of Charles Calthrop, as one might expect. Not a lock of his hair. Instead, the locket contained a tiny, exquisitely painted miniature on ivory. It was the portrait of a young man with lean, sharp features and intense, dark eyes. A face she had seen just days before, brooding in a summer fete. It was the face of Julian Croft. The breath caught in Miss Marple's throat, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound. So this was the truth. This was the secret. The locket, a gift from her husband, did not contain his image, but that of another man. A man who was now dead. Eleanor, sensing something, straightened up quickly, her hand flying to her throat. Her fingers found the open locket, and her eyes widened in a flash of pure panic. She snapped it shut with a sharp, metallic click, her face draining of all color. For a single unguarded moment, she looked not like the respectable widow of St. Mead's, but like a terrified animal caught in a trap. "There," she said. Her voice strained as she handed Miss Marple the retrieved knitting needle. "All safe and sound." "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said, her own voice a masterpiece of calm. "So kind of you." The rest of the visit passed in a blur of polite conversation, but the air in the room had changed. Miss Marple had seen the truth, and Eleanor knew it. The carefully maintained faculty of Laurel Lodge had developed a crack, and through it, a chilling darkness was now visible. As Miss Marple walked home, the image of that tiny portrait burned in her mind. It changed everything. Julian Croft was not merely an unwelcome acquaintance from the past. He had been the man Eleanor Calthrop truly loved. The locket was not a reminder of a faithful husband, but a secret tribute to a forbidden passion. And Charles Calthrop's boating accident, the financial troubles, Croft's arrival in the village, these were not separate threads. They were all part of the same dark tapestry. The police had their culprit, neatly packaged and ready for trial. But Miss Marple now knew, with a cold and certain clarity, that they were about to commit a grave miscarriage of justice. The killer was not in a cell in Maidenford. She was in Laurel Lodge, pouring tea, her lover's portrait hidden against her skin, and the weight of two men's deaths hanging heavy around her neck. The arrest of Lydia Marchant had, for the general populace of St. Mead's, drawn a line under the unpleasantness. Life, as it always does, began to reassert its familiar rhythms. The vicar turned his attention fully to the church roof fund. Colonel Wentworth found new and less murderous topics to hold forth on in the pub, and the postmaster's son resumed his bashful courtship of Clara Mayhew. The shadow of the priory no longer quite so dark over their meetings. Yet, for Miss Marple, the matter was more unsettled than ever. The discovery in the locket had not provided a clear path to justice, but rather had plunged her into a deeper ethical quandary. She had proof now, not of murder, but of a profound and dangerous secret. To reveal what she had seen would be a gross violation of social etiquette, and worse, it would be her word the word of a fluffy old lady against that of one of the village's most respected pillars. It would look like malice, or the senile fancy of a lonely spinster. No, direct accusation was impossible. The truth needed to be coaxed into the light, to be made to reveal itself. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion outside her garden gate. Young Tommy Pierce, the gardener's boy who worked for several households, including Laurel Lodge, was engaged in a heated altercation with Mr. Edgware, the butcher, over a bicycle that had apparently scraped the paint of the butcher's delivery van. W isn't even looking, you young fool. Mr. Edgware was booming. Was so. You pulled out without signaling. Tommy retorted, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and defiance. Miss Marple watched the scene with interest. It was not the petty argument itself that caught her attention, but the specific nature of Tommy's defiance. He was a weedy, somewhat sullen youth, but he had a certain cunning, and he was a notorious magpie, his pockets often filled with bits of string, interesting stones, and other detritus he found on his rounds. He was, in short, a collector of information, both intentional and accidental. She waited until Mr. Edgeworks had driven off, muttering darkly, and Tommy was left scowling at his scratched bicycle. Such a nuisance. These modern vehicles, Miss Marple said, opening her gate and smiling benignly. They make so much more noise than the horses ever did. I often think they frighten the birds. Tommy, startled, shuffled his feet. Yes, miss. I couldn't help but overhear, she continued, her tone conversational. You've been having a difficult time of it lately, haven't you? What with all the goings-on at the Priory? It must have been a terrible shock for you, finding the place taped off by the police. The boy's eyes widened. I didn't find him. That was Mrs. Pickering. Oh, I know, dear, I know, Miss Marple soothed. But you do work there, don't you? Tending the vegetable patch. Such a shame, all those lovely lettuces going to waste now. I suppose you were there the morning it happened? Before all the fuss? Tommy looked shiftier. Might have been. Just to check on the compost heap. Didn't see nothing. That's just as well. A young boy shouldn't see such things. She sighed, a picture of gentle concern. It's a pity, though. The police are so focused on poor Miss Marchant, I doubt they've even properly searched the grounds. A place like that, with all its nooks and crannies. Why, the real clue might be lying out there still, waiting. I remember a case my nephew Raymond told me about, where the vital piece of evidence was a single button, caught in a bramble bush 100 yards from the house. The police never found it, but a local boy, much like yourself, did. There was a reward, of course. Quite a substantial one. She let the word reward hang in the air, watching its effect on Tommy's face. The sullenness was replaced by a keen, avaricious glint. A reward? He repeated. Oh, yes. The family was most grateful. It helped bring the true criminal to justice. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. If I were a clever boy like you, I might have a careful look around the edges of the Priory grounds. Somewhere a person might wait, or hide, or drop something in a hurry. Somewhere the police, in their heavy boots, would never think to look. She gave him another vague, sweet smile and retreated into her garden, leaving Tommy Pierce staring after her, his earlier anger forgotten, his mind now buzzing with the possibilities of hidden treasure and substantial rewards. 2 days later, as Miss Marple was pruning her roses, a shadow fell over the flower bed. It was Tommy. He stood, twisting his cap in his hands, his expression a mixture of triumph and nervousness. Miss, you was right. Oh? Miss Marple said, setting down her secateurs. I had a look. Like you said, in the old summer house, down by the bottom of the Priory garden. All rotten and covered in ivy. It is. Nobody ever goes there. He thrust a grubby hand into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic object. Found this, caught in a splinter on the floorboards. He dropped it into her outstretched palm. It was a cufflink. Not a particularly fine one, but distinctive. It was made of silver, and its face was engraved with a simple, elegant design. A sheaf of wheat. Miss Marple's heart gave a quiet, triumphant thud. She had seen this design before. She had seen it on the sleeve of Charles Calthrop's portrait that hung in the dining room at Laurel Lodge. It was part of his family crest. This was not Julian Croft's. It was far too traditional for his austere tastes. And it was certainly not Lydia Marchant's. This cufflink belonged to Eleanor Calthrop's late husband. "Very interesting, Tommy," she said, her voice calm. "A curious thing to find so far from the house. You have been very clever." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced a 10-shilling note. "For your trouble, and for your discretion. We wouldn't want to trouble Mrs. Calthrop with this just yet, would we? It might upset her. The memory of her poor husband, you understand." Tommy's eyes gleamed as he snatched the note. "Yes, miss." "Not a word, miss." And he scurried away. Wealthier and wiser, Miss Marple closed her hand around the cufflink. It was cold and hard against her skin. The summer house. A perfect hidden vantage point from which to watch the lane to the old priory. A place to wait for the mist to thicken, to shed a bright, identifiable coat, and to perhaps, in the nervous frenzy of the act, lose a single, telling item from a past one had hoped was buried. The case against Eleanor was no longer just based on human observation and a hidden portrait. It now had a tangible, physical clue. A clue that placed someone connected to Charles Calthrop, and by extension, to Eleanor herself, at the scene of Julian Croft's murder. The candle had illuminated the secret in the locket, and now a gardener's boy had unearthed the key that could lock the cell door. The question was no longer who, but how to make the final, damning connection. The cufflink, cool and accusatory in her dresser drawer, presented Miss Marple with her final, most delicate challenge. She had the means to point the police in the right direction, but to do so crudely would be to risk everything. Inspector Druitt was a man of facts, not nuances. He would see a cufflink belonging to a dead man and dismiss it as irrelevant debris. No, the truth needed to be drawn out, not bludgeoned. It required a setting where human nature, when pressed, would betray itself. She found her stage the very next day when a note arrived from Eleanor Calthrop. It was an invitation, couched in the language of gratitude and resumed normalcy for a small, private luncheon at Laurel Lodge. The guests were to be Miss Marple, Dr. Stephen Mayhew, and Clara. It was, Miss Marple sensed, Eleanor's final act in the play she had written for herself. The gracious hostess, resilient in the face of family scandal, re-establishing her circle. The luncheon was a quiet affair, served in the sunny morning room. The conversation was stilted, dancing around the great, ugly fact of Lydia's incarceration. Eleanor was paler than usual, her composure a brittle shell. She spoke of the church flowers and the prospects for the harvest, but her eyes were restless, her laughter a beat too late. It was Clara, young and still thrillingly aware of the drama, who inadvertently provided the opening. "It's all so unbelievable still," she mused, pushing a piece of cucumber around her plate. "To think of Miss Marchant, of all people, being capable of such violence. I know she was theatrical, but murder? It makes you wonder what hidden passions people are capable of." Dr. Mayhew, ever the rationalist, shook his head. "Passion, perhaps, but often it's colder than that. Calculation, greed, fear of exposure." Eleanor's fork clinked softly against her plate. "Exposure? Of a secret," Stephen said, warming to his theme. "I've seen it in my practice. A patient will endure a minor ailment for years, but the moment it threatens to become a public embarrassment, they seek the most drastic cure. It's the same with the human psyche. The fear of a hidden truth coming to light can drive people to extreme acts. Miss Marple saw her moment. She dabbed her lips with her napkin, her movements slow and deliberate. "How very true, Doctor," she said, her voice gentle and musing. "It reminds me so much of a sad little affair that happened in St. Mary Mead. Oh, many years ago now. A woman, much respected, was being blackmailed by a man from her past. A man she had once cared for a great deal. The room went very still. Eleanor had frozen, a piece of salmon poised on her fork. This woman, Miss Marple continued, her gaze fixed on the middle distance, as if recalling a fond memory, was in a terrible predicament. She loved her husband, you see, and her position in the village. The blackmailer threatened to reveal their old association, to brand her as having been unsuitable. He didn't want a great deal of money, just a little, regularly. It was the constant dread that wore her down. What happened? Clara breathed, enthralled. Oh, she paid for a time, Miss Marple said. But the demands grew, and she realized he would never stop. He enjoyed the power. The final demand was not for money, but for a token locket he had given her, which her husband believed was his own gift. He wanted it back to prove his hold over her. She sighed, a soft, regretful sound. She arranged to meet him, to reason with him. They argued, and in a moment of blind panic, of terror at the thought of exposure, she struck him with a heavy stone paperweight that was lying to hand. Eleanor Calthrop made a small, choked sound. Her face was the color of chalk. The tragic thing, Miss Marple went on, her eyes now drifting to meet Eleanor's, was that the locket wasn't the point. The point was the portrait inside. It was his, and her husband, a good but conventional man, would never have understood. Her entire life, her hard-won respectability, would have crumbled to dust. She let the silence hang, heavy and profound. The parallel was too exact, too devastatingly clear. Stephen and Clara were looking at Miss Marple with dawning comprehension, and their gazes shifted, almost involuntarily, towards their hostess. Eleanor stared at Miss Marple, and in her eyes was a wild, trapped look. The facade shattered. "You," she whispered, the word a dry rasp. "You know? I know that the past is never truly gone, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice unbearably kind. "I know that Julian Croft was not a stranger to you. He was the man in the locket, the man you loved before you married Charles. And he came here not for the quiet life, but for you." The confession did not come in a torrent, but in a slow, agonizing collapse. It was as if Miss Marple's story had pulled a single vital thread, and the whole tapestry of Eleanor's life was unraveling before them. He found me after Charles died," she said, her voice hollow, her eyes seeing not the room, but the past. "He said he'd never stopped loving me, but it wasn't love. It was possession. He was furious that I had married another, that I had sold myself, as he put it, for security. He knew Charles had been unfaithful. He knew about the financial troubles. He said I had chosen a hollow man and a hollow life. He started demanding money, small sums at first, for old time's sake, then more. And you paid," Miss Marple stated softly. "What else could I do?" A spark of her old fire returned, bitter and desperate. "He threatened to tell everyone, to reveal the locket, to tell them Charles's fortune was gone, that I was a kept woman living on borrowed time and borrowed respectability. The candle at the fete was his idea. A final public joke, a symbol of the village's light given by me to him. He laughed when I gave it to him. He said it was the final payment before he left St. Mead's for good. But I knew he would never leave. He would always be there, in the shadows, demanding more. She looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. I went to see him that morning, to beg him one last time. I took an old coat of Lydia's from the hall cupboard. It was bright. I wasn't thinking, and I wore a hat to hide my face. I thought if anyone saw me, they might think it was her. She was always wandering about at odd hours. The admission was chilling in its calculation. We argued. He was triumphant. He held the candle, mocking me. And then I saw it. The silver holder. So heavy. I snatched it and I swung. The silence in the room was absolute. Clara had her hand over her mouth. Stephen Mayhew looked profoundly shocked. I ran, Eleanor whispered. I dropped the candle. I don't know why. I just ran. I went through the bottom of the garden, through the old summer house, and back through the lanes. I didn't even know I'd lost Charles's cufflink until later. I thought I was safe. And then when Arthur said he saw a woman in a bright coat, and it was Lydia's, it was like a gift. A terrible, perfect gift. She looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes brimming with a terrible clarity. How did you know? Miss Marple's gaze was steady, full of a pity that held no forgiveness. Because, my dear, she said quietly, blackmail is a weed that cannot be hidden forever. It always breaks through the pavement. And the human heart, when cornered, follows the same sad, predictable patterns. I am only sorry that your pattern led to this. There was no denunciation, no dramatic accusation. Only the quiet, devastating weight of the truth, finally spoken aloud in the elegant morning room of Laurel Lodge. With the scent of luncheon roses still sweet in the air, the aftermath in the morning room was one of stunned, silent horror. Clara Mayhew looked as if she might be sick. Dr. Stephen Mayhew, his professional instincts warring with his personal shock, had half risen from his chair, unsure whether to offer medical assistance or to restrain the confessed murderers. Eleanor Calthrop simply sat, her head bowed. The elegant architecture of her composure collapsed into rubble. The performance was over. Miss Marple, however, remained perfectly still. She had not come to accuse, but to provide the conditions for the truth to emerge. And now that it had, her work was nearly complete. It was Stephen who broke the silence, his voice hushed and grave. Mrs. Calthrop, Eleanor, you understand what this means. I must telephone Inspector Druitt. Eleanor did not look up. She gave a single weary nod, a gesture of utter defeat. Yes, of course. She seemed almost relieved. The terrible burden of the secret finally lifted, even if what replaced it was the heavier weight of justice. While Stephen went to the telephone in the hall, his voice a low, urgent murmur. Clara sat frozen, her wide eyes fixed on Eleanor. Miss Marple rose and went to the sideboard, pouring a small glass of water from the crystal jug. She brought it to Eleanor, who took it with a trembling hand but did not drink. It was the locket, wasn't it? Eleanor said, her voice a dry whisper. That's how you knew. The locket was the key that unlocked the door, Miss Marple agreed, resuming her seat. But it was the pattern that showed me the room beyond. The pattern of a certain type of person, one who values respectability above all else. You are not being blackmailed merely for money, my dear. You are being blackmailed for your very identity in this village. It is a powerful motive. I have seen it before. I loved him once, Eleanor murmured, more to herself than to her audience. Julian, He was so passionate, so alive. But he was also reckless. He had no money, no prospects. When Charles Calthrop, so stable, so respectable, proposed, it seemed like a lifeline. My family was so pleased. Letting Julian go was the practical thing to do. I thought I had buried those feelings. I wore the locket he had given me, but I let Charles believe it was from him. It was my little secret, my little rebellion. I never dreamed Julian would find me, or that he would become so cruel. Miss Marple listened, her expression one of quiet absorption. She was not unsympathetic, but her sympathy was of a clear-eyed, unsentimental kind. She understood the anatomy of the crime, the slow, grinding pressure that had led to the single, explosive moment of violence. The sound of a car door slamming outside broke the spell. Moments later, Inspector Druitt, his face a mask of professional sternness and barely concealed astonishment, stood in the doorway with a uniformed constable. Stephen Mayhew hovered behind them. Mrs. Calthrop, the inspector began, his voice formal. Dr. Mayhew has informed me of a very serious statement you have made. Eleanor looked up, and with a residue of her old dignity, she met his gaze. It is true, Inspector. I killed Julian Croft. The rest was a grim procedural formality. Eleanor was read her rights, her quiet, monotone confession repeated for the official record. She offered no resistance, no further drama. As she was led from the morning room, her steps were slow but steady. She did not look back. Miss Marple, Stephen, and Clara stood in the hall, watching the police car pull away from Laurel Lodge, taking the true murderer of Julian Croft to Maidenford, while miles away in a cold cell, an innocent woman awaited her fate. I can't believe it, Clara whispered, her face pale. She seemed so kind. The most dangerous poison, Miss Marple said, her gaze still fixed on the empty driveway, is often stored in the prettiest bottles. She turned to Stephen. Doctor, you must telephone the authorities in Maidenford at once. Lydia Marchant must be released immediately. Of course, Stephen said, shaking his head as if to clear it. It's a miracle you pieced it together, Miss Marple. The police were so certain. The police looked for fingerprints and footmarks, my dear doctor, Miss Marple replied, gathering her cardigan about her. Which is all very well and good, but the patterns of human nature are, in their own way, just as indelible. One simply has to know where to look for them. She took her leave, walking out into the afternoon sun. The business, for now, was done. The final, painful stitch had been made in the tapestry, completing the picture, however ugly it was. But as she knew all too well, the aftermath of such a revelation was often just as telling as the crime itself. The return to normalcy in St. Mead's would be a long and complicated process, and the story of the candle that never burned out was not quite over. There was still the matter of an innocent woman, a shattered reputation, and a village that had been proven to be not nearly as peaceful as it appeared. The release of Lydia Marchant 2 days later was a spectacle of an entirely different order from her arrest. There were no flashing cameras. This was St. Mead's, after all, but the news had spread, and a small, awkward crowd gathered outside the police station in Maidenford. Lydia emerged not with defiant flair, but leaning on the arm of her sleek city lawyer, her face pale and drawn beneath a veil, every inch the wronged and traumatized woman. It was, Miss Marple thought upon hearing the description from Cherry, who had it from the postman's sister, a masterful performance. Perhaps her finest yet. The real drama, however, was reserved for the village. The revelation that Eleanor Calthrop was the murderer sent a shockwave through St. Mead's that was far more profound than Lydia's arrest had ever been. This was not an outsider. This was one of their own, the very embodiment of village respectability. The foundations of their quiet world seemed to tremble. Conversations were held in hushed, horrified tones behind closed doors. The Colonel was uncharacteristically quiet for a full week, and Beatrice Wentworth could be seen peering from behind her net curtains with a new, fearful vigilance. Miss Marple found herself the reluctant center of a subdued kind of attention. The story of her role in the unmasking had, as such stories do, leaked out. She was not hailed as a hero that would be far too vulgar, but was treated with a new, profound respect tinged with a hint of wariness. She had proven that her gentle, old lady demeanor concealed a mind that could see into the darkest corners of the human heart. And there were those in St. Mead's who, upon reflection, found that notion distinctly unsettling. It was on a cool, gray afternoon, about a fortnight after Eleanor's confession, that the final loose thread of the affair presented itself. Miss Marple was taking her customary walk, her thoughts orderly and calm, when she saw a familiar figure ahead on the lane. It was Lydia Marchant, dressed once more in a color a little too vivid for the somber day, a deep emerald green. She was standing at the iron gates of Laurel Lodge, which now stood closed and silent, its windows like blind eyes. "Miss Marple," Lydia said, turning as Miss Marple approached. Her voice had lost some of its theatrical vibrato. It was quieter, more thoughtful. "I suppose I have you to thank." "There is no thanks required, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "The truth has its own imperative." Lydia's gaze returned to the shuttered house. "She hated me, you know." "Oh, she was always perfectly polite, always the generous cousin. But she hated having me here, a reminder of a more vulgar, less respectable world. I think she was always afraid I would see through her." A small, bitter smile touched her lips. "And in the end, I was the perfect scapegoat. The flashy, greedy London cousin. It was almost too easy for her." "It is a terrible thing," Miss Marple said, "to be so afraid of losing one's place in the world that one is willing to sacrifice another to keep it." Lydia was silent for a long moment. "They found Charles's cufflink, you know, the one she lost. The police told my lawyer. It was the final piece of evidence, they said, though her confession was enough." She turned her sharp eyes on Miss Marple. "It's odd, isn't it? She killed the man she once loved and framed the cousin she despised, all to protect the memory of a husband she knew had been unfaithful and had left her nearly penniless." "What a muddle." "Human nature frequently is," Miss Marple agreed. "It rarely conforms to the neat patterns we would prefer." "Well," Lydia said, squaring her shoulders with a resolve that seemed, for the first time, entirely genuine, "there is nothing for me here now. I shall be leaving St. Mead's. There is a small flat in London, and a friend who runs a gallery. It seems a more suitable world for me than this one." She gave a last, long look at Laurel Lodge. She wanted so desperately to keep this. And now she has lost it all. With a nod that was almost respectful, Lydia Marchant turned and walked away down the lane, her green coat a final vivid stroke against the gray landscape. Miss Marple continued her walk, her mind turning over Lydia's words. She thought of the candle, the symbol of light that had been used as a bludgeon. She thought of the locket, a token of love that had become a prison of secrets. She thought of Eleanor, who had valued the appearance of goodness over the substance of it, and in doing so had committed the ultimate evil. The village would heal, of course. In a year, perhaps two, new scandals would eclipse the memory of the Calthrop affair. Laurel Lodge would be sold to a new family from London, unaware of its history. The St. Mead's summer fete would go on, though the tradition of the candle would likely be quietly retired. But for Miss Marple, sitting now in her quiet garden as the evening drew in, the case of the candle that never burned out would remain a poignant reminder. The candle itself had never been lit, its potential for light extinguished before it could ever truly glow. So, too, had the lives it touched been defined by a light that was never truly there, the illusion of respectability, the ghost of a past love, the deceptive sparkle of a happy village life. It was, she reflected, a story not of grand evil, but of small, desperate choices that had curdled into something monstrous. And as the first star appeared in the twilight sky, she gave a small, sad sigh for the frailty of human hearts, and the darkness that could fester in the most peaceful of places. The following week, a semblance of routine began to reclaim St. Mead's. The initial fevered shock had subsided, replaced by a low, persistent. The vicar's study was a comfortable, book-lined room that smelled of old leather and beeswax. Mr. Pettigrew, a man whose kindness often outstripped his grasp of temporal complexities, fussed over the tea tray, while Amelia watched Miss Marple with an expression of deep, sympathetic curiosity. "It has been a most troubling time, Miss Marple," the vicar began, handing her a cup of steaming Earl Grey. "Most troubling. To think such darkness was festering in our very midst. It quite shakes one's faith in one's fellow man." "Oh, I don't know, Theodore," Amelia said gently, passing a plate of seed cake. "I think it is more a lesson in the perils of presentation, the danger of valuing the appearance of goodness over the practice of it." "A very astute observation, my dear," Miss Marple agreed. Eleanor Calthrop was, in many ways, a model of village virtue, but it was a virtue maintained for public consumption. Behind it lay a great deal of fear. "Fear of poverty?" the vicar asked, his brow furrowed. "That was a part of it, certainly." Miss Marple nodded. "But a deeper fear, I think. The fear of being known." She had built her life on a foundation of half-truths, a marriage of convenience she presented as a love match, a locket from a lover she passed off as a gift from her husband. When Julian Croft arrived, he threatened to strip all that away. He was not just a blackmailer. He was a walking, talking embodiment of her own compromises and deceptions. Amelia shuddered. To be so trapped by one's own past. "It is a dreadful thought." "It is a common enough tragedy," Miss Marple replied, taking a small, precise bite of cake, "though it rarely ends so violently. I am reminded of a woman in my own village, a Mrs. Pritchard, who for years pretended her son was a missionary in Africa, when in fact he was serving a prison sentence for embezzlement. The strain of the lie made her a bitter, suspicious woman. The truth, when it finally came out, was almost a relief." "And what of poor Lydia?" the vicar asked. "To have been so used." "Lydia will recover," Miss Marple said with quiet certainty. "She is resilient, and I suspect she has learned something of the cost of being a spectacle. Her departure from the village has a note of finality to it. She is seeking a world where her particular brand of theatrics is less likely to be mistaken for guilt." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "And you, Miss Marple?" Amelia ventured. "Does it not distress you to have looked into such a dark affair and to have seen it so clearly?" Miss Marple considered this, her pale blue eyes thoughtful. "It is not a pleasant thing, my dear, to see the worst of which people are capable. But it is a necessary thing. Evil thrives in the shadows. To bring it into the light, however painful the glare, is the only way to defeat it. One cannot cure a disease by pretending the symptoms do not exist." She set her cup down carefully in its saucer. "And there is a certain order to it all, a pattern. Human nature, in its greed, its fear, its pride, is remarkably consistent. Untangling, it is like untangling a particularly knotted ball of yarn. It requires patience and a keen eye, but the underlying threads are always the same." The vicar shook his head in wonder. "You make it sound like one of your knitting patterns, Miss Marple." She offered him a small, gentle smile. "In many ways, vicar, it is. The same stitches, repeated in different combinations, can create either a thing of beauty or a dreadful muddle. My role is not to pass judgment on the knitter, but simply to identify where a stitch was dropped, where the pattern went awry. The rest, she sighed, is in the hands of a higher authority. As she took her leave a short while later, walking back through the quiet vicarage garden, Miss Marple felt a sense of closure. The mystery was solved, the innocent freed, the guilty confessed. The practical matters were settled. Yet, as she knew all too well, the emotional reverberations of such an event would echo through the lives of the villagers for a long time to come. The final chapter of the affair was not about justice or deduction, but about the slow, quiet process of a community learning to live with the truth it never wanted to see. And for that, there was no easy pattern to follow. The story of the candle that never burned out did not truly end with Eleanor Calthrop's confession, nor with Lydia Marchant's departure. Its final echoes were heard in the small, quiet adjustments that settled over St. Mead's in the ensuing months. Like dust in a room after a great commotion, Laurel Lodge was put up for sale. It was purchased, ironically enough, by a retired orchestra conductor from London, a man with no knowledge of village history and a taste for dramatic landscaping. The new owner promptly had the old summer house at the bottom of the garden, that silent witness to a terrible panic, torn down. Miss Marple saw the pile of splintered wood and tangled ivy one day on her walk, and gave a small, satisfied nod. Some things were better cleared away. The St. Mead's summer fete was held the following year, though it was a more subdued affair. There was no ornate box, no ceremonial candle. Colonel Wentworth, perhaps chastened by his role in nearly condemning an innocent woman, confined his pronouncements to the weather and the state of the cricket pitch. The shadow of the past had softened, but it had not vanished entirely. It lingered in the way people would sometimes glance towards the now inhabited Laurel Lodge, or in the occasional hushed mention of Eleanor's name, always followed by a swift change of subject. For Miss Marple, life returned to its familiar rhythm of knitting, gardening, and gentle observation. She had been right, and the village knew it, but the knowledge brought her no particular pleasure, only a sober confirmation of her understanding of the world. One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer, she came across the small, silver sheaf of wheat cufflink that Tommy Pierce had found. She held it in her palm, its weight insignificant, its meaning profound, that it was not evidence anymore. It was a relic, a tiny, metallic piece of a broken life. It spoke of Charles Calthrop, the husband whose memory Eleanor had fought so desperately to protect, even as she defiled it. It spoke of a moment of blind terror in a dusty summer house. It was a truth that had needed to be uncovered, but holding it now felt like holding a shard of someone else's pain. She did not keep it. Later that day, she walked down to the little stone bridge that crossed the meandering stream at the edge of the village. Without ceremony, she dropped the cufflink into the dark, slow-moving water. It vanished with a soft plink, swallowed by the depths. It was not her secret to keep, nor her trophy to hold. It was simply a piece of the past, now returned to the silence from which it had come dot as she turned for home. The setting sun caught the windows of the cottages, setting them ablaze for a brief, beautiful moment. St. Mead's looked as peaceful as ever, a perfect picture of English rural life. But Miss Marple knew better now. She saw the fragility of the piece, the secrets that lay behind the neat hedges and lace curtains. The candle had been a symbol of a light that was never truly there, but its extinguishing had revealed the real flawed and often sorrowful humanity that was the village's true heart. She unlocked her front door, stepping into the comforting familiarity of her own cottage. The mystery was over, the last thread neatly tucked away. There would be others, of course. There always were. But for now, there was the gentle click of knitting needles, the scent of roses from the garden, and the quiet, enduring knowledge that even in the most peaceful of places, the patterns of human nature in all their dark and light complexity would continue to unfold, waiting only for a keen and sympathetic eye to read them.